You didn't run out of words. You ran out of faith that words would save you. There was a time when you believed explanation was the answer, that if you spoke clearly enough, gently enough, patiently enough, things would finally settle. That understanding was just one perfectly chosen sentence away. That if people truly heard you, everything would soften. So you explained your intentions before anyone called them into question. You explained your feelings so they wouldn't seem too much. You explained your boundaries as if they were negotiable ideas rather than quiet necessities. You explained yourself even when no one had asked. And at first, it felt responsible, mature, civil, but slowly, almost without noticing, explaining stopped bringing relief. It began to feel like labor, because every time you explained, you weren't met halfway. You were met with silence, or correction, or subtle resistance, sometimes with nothing at all, just the sense that your words had landed nowhere. You walked people through your thoughts carefully, as if they were fragile glass. You added context. You softened truth. You chose language that wouldn't disrupt anyone else's comfort. Yet the more carefully you spoke, the less you felt seen. That is where something in you first cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from talking and talking, only to realize the room has never been listening. From explaining yourself so often that your own thoughts start to feel foreign. From managing conversations instead of participating in them. You noticed it before you could name it. In the pause before replying to a message, in the weight that settled in your chest before a conversation you already knew would require justification. In the rehearsals you ran through your mind, preparing to defend choices that had already been made. Words started to feel less like bridges and more like evidence, something you were expected to provide. And the burden of clarity always fell on you. You became familiar with questions that weren't really questions, with curiosity that wasn't curious, with listening that only lasted long enough to find something to challenge. You weren't being misunderstood. You were being evaluated. So you explained more. You tried different phrasing, different tones, different versions of yourself. You minimized, you clarified, you rephrased, you apologized for reactions you shouldn't have had to justify in the first place. And still nothing shifted. That's when words truly began to fail you. Not because language is weak, but because it cannot repair spaces where respect is missing. You started to sense that explaining yourself wasn't bringing connection, it was feeding imbalance. The more you explained, the more people expected explanation. The more you clarified, the more they questioned. The more you spoke, the less solid you felt. You began talking around yourself instead of from yourself. There is a quiet loneliness in realizing your honesty has become a performance, that your voice exists only in response to someone else's doubt. That conversation feels like a courtroom where you are constantly pleading your case. You tried to tell yourself this was normal, that this was how grown conversations worked, but your body knew better. Because relief never came after explaining, only tiredness. You reached a point where silence felt easier than speech, not out of avoidance, but out of self-protection, where saying less felt cleaner, where not responding immediately felt like breathing. Words stopped working the day you realized they were being used to measure you instead of understand you. The day your explanations became invitations for more scrutiny. The day your clarity stopped being received and started being negotiated. And a quiet truth emerged. People who want to understand you don't require endless explanations. People who benefit from your confusion do. Once you saw that, you couldn't unsee it. You noticed how rarely others explained themselves to you, how your patience was assumed while your clarity was questioned, how your silence made space, but your words made demands. Slowly, something shifted inside, not outwardly, not visibly, but deeply. You stopped filling pauses. You stopped overcorrecting. You stopped translating your feelings into something more acceptable. Not because you had nothing to say, but because you finally understood something vital. Your worth didn't depend on being understood by everyone. Your silence began to feel different, not heavy, but grounded, not defensive, but steady. It wasn't withdrawal, it was discernment. And in that stillness, you noticed something unexpected. You felt closer to yourself. For the first time, you weren't tailoring your truth. You weren't preparing explanations in advance. You weren't anticipating objections. You were simply there. Words hadn't stopped working because they failed you. They stopped working because you no longer needed to prove that your experience was valid. Because you finally realized this. Not everyone is owed access to your inner world. Not every truth needs defending. Not every silence needs filling. And the moment you stopped explaining, something else took its place, something steadier than language, clarity. This is where it begins. You didn't start justifying yourself because you enjoyed explaining. You started because, at some point, your existence began to feel like something that needed permission. No one sat you down and taught you this habit directly. It formed quietly through tone, through reactions, through what was left unsaid, through the subtle signals that told you your choices were acceptable only if they made sense to others. So you learned to explain before being questioned, to soften your decisions with reasons, to present your needs wrapped in logic, politeness, and restraint. Not because you doubted yourself at first, but because doubt kept being placed on you. Somewhere along the way, justification felt safer than confidence. You realized early that certainty unsettled people, that self-assurance invited interrogation, that saying, "This is what I want," without context, could provoke discomfort, disappointment, or resistance. So instead of stating your truth, you began building a case for it, and the habit stuck. You justified your rest. You justified your distance. You justified your choices. You justified your boundaries. Even the smallest decisions came with footnotes, as if your life required peer review. What you didn't know then was that this habit was never about communication, it was about survival. Because when your needs are consistently questioned, you start explaining them as proof that they're reasonable. When your feelings are minimized, you begin defending them with examples. When your decisions are challenged, you start presenting evidence. You weren't trying to convince others. You were trying to avoid conflict. And over time, justification became automatic, reflexive, invisible to everyone except your body, which carried the weight of it silently. Think about how often you've rehearsed conversations in your head, how many times you planned explanations that never came, how frequently you've added, "if that makes sense," to the end of a sentence, even when it already did. You weren't unsure. You were cautious. Cautious because past experiences taught you that your truth came with consequences, that your preferences disrupted balance, that your needs inconvenienced people, so you made them digestible. You shrank language. You diluted intention. You dressed clarity in reassurance. And somewhere in this pattern, something subtle happened. Your choices stopped feeling like choices and started feeling like defenses. You noticed how conversations didn't feel like exchanges anymore. They felt like negotiations, like somewhere between expression and permission. You explained why you were tired instead of just resting. You explained why you couldn't show up instead of simply not showing up. You explained your silence instead of letting it exist. And the cost didn't show up all at once. It showed up as hesitation, as second-guessing, as an uneasy awareness that you were always making space for reactions that weren't even happening yet. The habit of justifying yourself slowly teaches you something dangerous, that your truth is only acceptable once it's approved. You begin measuring your words before speaking, adjusting your tone mid-sentence, anticipating objections before your point is fully formed. You become aware of how your honesty might land before you allow it to land. And that awareness turns inward. You start questioning your own instinct. You start needing reasons to trust yourself. You start explaining things to yourself that never needed explanation. That's when self-justification replaces self-trust. And here's the part that's difficult to see while you're inside it. People rarely ask for justification when they respect you. They don't demand reasons for your boundaries. They don't require explanations for your distance. They don't interrogate your decisions under the guise of concern. The habit didn't form because too many people needed clarity. It formed because too many people felt entitled to your choices. And once entitlement enters a space, justification follows. You began carrying the responsibility of making others comfortable with your truth, a responsibility that was never yours to hold. This is why explaining never brought relief. Because relief doesn't come from being understood by people who are committed to misunderstanding. And yet, you kept trying. Because part of you believed that if you spoke carefully enough, the tension would dissolve. That if you framed things gently enough, respect would appear. But respect doesn't come from explanation. It comes from recognition. And recognition cannot be negotiated. There comes a moment when your body starts resisting this habit, even if your mind still follows it. A moment when explaining feels heavy. When you pause mid-sentence and feel the urge to stop talking altogether, not because you have nothing to say, but because you're tired of defending something that should stand on its own. That moment matters. It's the first sign that you're noticing the pattern, not just performing it. You start recognizing when explanations are offered unnecessarily, when you're answering questions that weren't asked, when you're justifying decisions that don't require consensus. And slowly, very slowly, you begin experimenting with something unfamiliar. Silence. Pause. Statement without clarification. It feels uncomfortable at first. Exposed, like stepping into a room without armor. But it also feels honest, because for the first time, you are not presenting your life for approval. You are letting it exist. Breaking the habit of justification isn't about becoming rigid or distant. It's about remembering that your experience is not on trial. You don't owe explanations for wanting space. You don't owe reasons for changing your mind. You don't owe logic for honoring yourself. And the moment you begin to accept that internally, something changes externally too. Your words become fewer but heavier. Your voice becomes quieter but clearer. Your presence becomes steadier because it no longer seeks validation. This habit didn't define you. It was something you learned, and anything learned can be unlearned. Not all at once, not loudly, but deliberately. And this is where the next shift begins. Not in how others respond, but in how much permission you stop asking for. This is the moment you start noticing how much of yourself was spent explaining and how much might return once you stop. And that realization will cost you something. But that comes next. There were people in your life who didn't ask for understanding. They asked for access. And clarity was the price they charged. They didn't say it outright. They never framed it as control. They called it concern. They called it curiosity. They called it honesty. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. Your explanations made their comfort possible. They weren't interested in knowing you. They were interested in knowing where they stood in relation to you, how much influence they had, how much space they could take, how far they could reach. So they asked questions that didn't lead to connection. They asked questions that led to leverage. Why are you doing it this way? What changed? Who influenced you? Are you sure this is right for you? Each question sounded reasonable, even caring, but together they formed an interrogation disguised as closeness. And you answered. You explained because you were taught that Reasonable people explain themselves. That calm answers would prevent misinterpretation. That clarity would remove tension. But what clarity actually removed was resistance. Your words helped them adjust not to you, but to how to negotiate around you. They listened carefully, not to understand your needs, but to learn how to redirect them. They learned where your guilt lived. They learned what made you hesitate. They learned which phrases softened you. They learned how much reassurance you needed before making a choice. Your explanations became instructions, and the more you explained, the more you were expected to, because clarity invites appetite in people who benefit from it. They grew accustomed to being consulted, to being included in decisions that weren't theirs, to having insight into your inner world, not so they could honor it, but so they could influence it. What you called transparency, they called opportunity. And still, you didn't see it clearly at first, because these were people who mattered to you, people whose approval felt important, people who were present during formative moments, people who had seen earlier versions of you versions that needed permission, that needed support, that needed affirmation. And slowly, without intention, the dynamic shifted. Your growth became something they needed to understand before allowing it. Your boundaries became something they needed context for. Your silence became something they felt entitled to interpret. Your distance became something they felt owed an explanation for. And you gave it, because somewhere inside, you believed that being clear would keep you connected, that making sense would keep the relationship intact. But what stayed intact wasn't the relationship. It was their access to you. You weren't being asked to clarify because you were unclear. You were being asked to clarify because your direction disrupted familiarity, and familiarity had made them comfortable. The truth is, people who benefit from your explanations rarely respect your decisions more because of them. They respect you less because explanation signals uncertainty even when none exists. It teaches others that your choices are negotiable, that your decisions are proposals, that your boundaries are discussions. And once that lesson is learned, it's repeated. They push a little further. They ask a little deeper. They express confusion that requires reassurance. They frame doubt as involvement. And you keep explaining because you don't want to seem difficult or distant or changed. So you translate your inner world into language they can digest. But the cost? The cost is that you begin living in response mode, responding to expectations before acting, responding to reactions before choosing, responding to pressure before clarity. You stop moving freely. You start moving carefully. And the people who demanded your clarity rarely carried any of this burden themselves. They didn't explain their expectations. They didn't clarify their assumptions. They didn't justify their demands. They simply expected, because from their perspective, your clarity wasn't a gift. It was a resource, one they used to maintain balance on their terms. And here's the hardest truth to face. Some people only feel comfortable with you when they can predict you, when they can map your decisions, when they can anticipate your reactions, when your growth moves at a pace they can keep up with. Your explanations made predictability possible. They helped others stay oriented in your life, even when you were changing. But growth isn't supposed to come with instructions for everyone else. At some point, clarity becomes exposure, and exposure becomes draining. Because explaining the same truths again and again doesn't make them clearer, it makes you tired. You begin noticing that after certain conversations, you feel empty. That after defending decisions you felt certain about, your certainty weakens. That after being understood, nothing actually changes. And slowly, something breaks. Not in anger, not in rebellion, but in awareness. You realize that the people who demanded your clarity never offered the same in return. They didn't explain their reactions. They didn't justify their dismissals. They didn't clarify why your boundaries unsettled them so deeply. They simply labeled you confusing, distant, different, changed. And suddenly, you see it. Your explanations were never meant to build mutual understanding. They were meant to preserve an old version of you. And once you realize this, clarity takes on a new meaning. It stops being something you owe others and becomes something you reserve for yourself. You begin noticing which questions come from curiosity and which come from control, which conversations invite honesty and which drain it. You begin choosing not to answer everything, not because you're hiding, but because not everything deserves access. And that discomfort you feel when you don't explain, that's not guilt. That's the absence of performance. This is the moment where everything starts to shift, not externally, but internally. Because once you see who benefited from your clarity, you also see what your silence can protect. And that understanding is not gentle, but it is necessary. Because next, something inside you begins to resist. Quietly, firmly, without consent. And that resistance changes everything. There is a particular kind of tiredness that doesn't come from work or lack of sleep or even grief. It comes from talking too much about things that were never meant to be debated. It begins innocently. You explain once, then again, then with more detail, then with softer words, then with patience layered over doubt. And somehow, the more you speak, the heavier everything becomes. Because this exhaustion is not caused by speaking, it's caused by performing coherence for people who never needed it, never protected it, never carried the cost of it. You weren't speaking to be heard, you were speaking to be acceptable. And that distinction wears a person down. You start noticing it in your body first. A tightness before certain conversations, a pause before responding to simple questions, a feeling of heaviness after saying things you were certain about before you had to explain them. The fatigue sneaks in quietly. You feel it when you rehearse sentences ahead of time, when you anticipate reactions before making choices, when you refine your language to sound reasonable instead of true. This is not communication. This is containment. You are containing reactions, containing misunderstandings, containing disappointment that might follow if you don't say the right thing. And over time, containment becomes depletion, because every explanation requires emotional labor, not visible labor, not measurable labor, but constant internal recalibration. You weigh words, you soften edges, you leave out parts that might complicate things. You add justifications where none are needed. And still, it's never enough. You finish explaining and find that nothing shifts. You spoke clearly, yet the demands remain. You were honest, yet you feel more erased. That's when the fatigue deepens. Because when words don't protect you, they begin to betray you. You notice your voice changes. You speak slower, quieter, with less conviction, not because you disagree with yourself, but because you're tired of defending reality. There's a point where talking starts to feel like carrying weight uphill. Each sentence costs something. Each clarification takes more than it gives back. And the exhaustion doesn't come from misunderstanding. It comes from being required to explain things that should be allowed. Why you're choosing differently. Why you don't feel the same anymore. Why you need space. Why you can't keep doing this. Every why asks you to reopen a decision. Every answer invites negotiation. Every explanation delays finality. And so you keep talking, hoping that clarity will bring relief. But relief never arrives, because the people who exhaust you with talking are not seeking understanding. They are seeking reassurance that nothing has changed too much. Your words are used to stabilize their discomfort, not honor your needs. And explaining becomes a trap. You explain to reduce tension, but the tension lingers. You explain to maintain connection, but feel more alone. You explain to be fair, but fairness keeps costing you more than them. This is when mental fatigue settles in. It shows up as overthinking after conversations, replaying things you said, wondering if it came out wrong, if you should have phrased it differently, if you created confusion, but the confusion isn't yours. It never was. You are exhausted not because you lack clarity, but because your clarity is constantly being challenged. And that challenge wears down your certainty. You stop trusting decisions that once felt solid. You check your instincts against other people's comfort. You hesitate where you used to act. The emotional fatigue deepens. You begin to dread conversations that used to feel neutral. You feel drained by messages that ask nothing more than explanation. You start craving silence, not for rest, but for relief. Relief from managing impressions. Relief from defending boundaries. Relief from pouring emotion into words that don't land. And at some point, something important happens. You realize that talking has become a substitute for being free to decide. As long as you're explaining, you're still engaged, still participating, still available for reaction. The quiet exhaustion of talking is the exhaustion of not being finished. You are never done explaining, never done clarifying, never done reassuring, because answers generate more questions, not resolution. And this is when your system starts to resist, not loudly, not dramatically, but by slowing down. You take longer to respond. You choose fewer words. You let silence stretch, not out of defiance, but because talking has stopped serving you. The fatigue becomes information. It tells you which conversations are too costly, which people drain more than they give, which explanations are actually negotiations disguised as dialogue. And once you notice this, something begins to change. You realize that understanding does not require constant explanation, that your choices don't need commentary, that your direction does not improve when dissected by others. You begin noticing that the most grounding moments are the quiet ones, not because they are comfortable, but because they are honest. Moments where you don't rush to clarify, moments where you don't fill gaps with justification, moments where you let decisions stand without defense. This isn't withdrawal, it's recalibration. And the exhaustion eases not because others change, but because you stop overfunctioning. You stop translating yourself into something easier to accept. You stop diluting truth to prevent reaction. You stop volunteering words where silence would protect you better. This is the line between fatigue and authority. Because when words stop working, awareness sharpens. And that awareness makes room for the next shift. Not outward, but inward. A resistance that doesn't argue. A knowing that doesn't explain. A quiet refusal to keep spending yourself on conversations that leave you emptier every time. And from here, everything begins to move differently. There is a moment that doesn't look like change from the outside. No announcement. No decision spoken out loud. No dramatic ending. Just a pause. The first time you didn't respond, it wasn't strategic. It wasn't planned. It wasn't meant to send a message. It happened because something inside you finally felt too tired to continue the pattern. The message arrived. The question lingered. The expectation hovered. And for the first time, your body didn't move toward explanation. You stared at the words longer than usual. Not because you didn't know what to say, but because saying anything felt like stepping back into a role you had already outgrown. That silence wasn't avoidance. It was recognition. Recognition that every response kept you available. Every reply reopened a cycle. Every explanation asked you to re-justify decisions you had already made internally. And without realizing it, you let the moment pass. At first, the quiet felt uncomfortable. Not because you were wrong, but because you had been conditioned to respond immediately, to reassure, to clarify, to smooth things over. Silence felt like negligence, like letting someone down, like breaking an invisible rule you had followed for years without question. You felt it in your chest. A slight tension, a guilt that didn't fully belong to you, an urge to rescue the moment before it turned into disappointment. But for the first time, you noticed something else alongside: the guilt. Relief. A small but undeniable relief. No mental rehearsal. No emotional labor. No crafting the right tone. Just stillness. And in that stillness, you realized how much energy your responses had been costing you. You had been living in reaction mode. Your attention always slightly tilted toward others. Your inner state constantly adjusting to maintain equilibrium. Not responding interrupted that pattern. It didn't solve everything, but it changed you. You noticed how often you replied just to keep things easy, how often your words were meant to stabilize situations you didn't create, how often you responded not from choice, but from obligation. And this time, you chose not to. That choice didn't feel strong. It felt fragile. You questioned it immediately, wondered if you were being unfair, if you were becoming distant, if silence would be misinterpreted. But underneath the doubt was a deeper knowing. Nothing bad happened when you didn't respond. The world didn't collapse. The situation didn't fall apart. You didn't lose yourself. In fact, you stayed with yourself for once. That's when you understood something quietly important. Your constant responsiveness had been a form of self-erasure. You had been present everywhere except inside your own experience. By stepping back, even momentarily, you reclaimed something essential: your attention. You began noticing how much pressure silence removed. No need to explain timing. No need to justify space. No need to manage expectations. The pause became a boundary you didn't have to announce. And once you felt how grounding it was, it became harder to return to old habits. You didn't stop responding forever. That was never the point. But you stopped responding automatically. You let yourself ask a different question before speaking. Do I actually want to engage with this? Not, is it polite? Not, will they understand? Not, will it cause tension? Just that one quiet inquiry. And answering it truthfully changed everything. Some messages no longer felt necessary. Some conversations lost their urgency. Some explanations simply expired. You realized how often you had been filling silence to prevent discomfort, mostly your own. And you saw how silence created a different kind of space, a space where you could feel your own reactions without immediately translating them for others. A space where clarity didn't have to be shared to be valid. A space where choice existed. That first non-response became a turning point, not because of what you did, but because of what you didn't do. You didn't perform. You didn't manage perception. You didn't shape yourself into something more palatable. You stayed with the discomfort, stayed with the uncertainty, stayed with your own boundaries, even unspoken. And the more you stayed, the less you felt pulled outward. You began recognizing how often people equated your availability with agreement, how quickly silence challenged their expectations, how your absence from a conversation revealed its true dynamics. Some reactions were subtle, some weren't, but none of them were as heavy as the exhaustion you used to feel after explaining. And that realization settled deeply. You began to understand that being reachable is not the same as being required, that responding is a choice, not a duty, that silence, when chosen deliberately, is not neglect. It is self-respect in practice. The first time you didn't respond wasn't about withdrawal. It was about authority returning, quietly, an internal authority, not one that demands, but one that decides. Decides when engagement serves you. Decides when clarity is internal. Decides when no response is the most honest response available. And slowly, the guilt faded. Not because others approved, but because you stopped needing approval to prioritize your mental space. You found that nothing essential was lost in the quiet. What was lost were the patterns that drained you, and what remained was something you hadn't felt in a long time: choice. That choice didn't make you louder. It didn't make you colder. It made you steadier. And from that steadiness, a new way of living began to form. One where you no longer measured your worth by how quickly or clearly you replied. One where silence was no longer something to fix, but something to trust. This was the first moment you stepped back without explaining. And it changed how you would move forward forever. There was a time when silence felt dangerous to you. A time when not responding meant losing control of the narrative. A time when you believed that if you didn't explain yourself, someone else would decide what your silence meant. So you rushed to speak. You filled the quiet. You corrected misunderstandings before they fully formed. You offered words as protection, but eventually something shifted, not dramatically, not all at once. You began to see that silence did not weaken you. It clarified you. Letting silence represent you is not withdrawal. It is a signal, one that carries more weight than explanation ever did. This kind of silence doesn't come from fear. It comes from discernment. You are no longer interested in persuading people to understand you. No longer committed to clearing every confusion. No longer responsible for managing how others interpret your choices. Because you finally understood something important. Those who listen with respect never needed explanations. Those who demand justification rarely accept it anyway. So you stopped overextending yourself emotionally. You didn't announce this change. You didn't defend it. You didn't ask permission. You simply allowed silence to stand where effort once lived. At first, it felt unnatural. There was a habit to break. The habit of engagement at all costs. The habit of availability. The habit of being the emotional translator in every interaction. You noticed how often people relied on your words to feel secure. How dependent some exchanges were on your reassurance. How accustomed others had become to you, smoothing things over. When you stepped back, it unsettled them. Not because you were wrong, but because the dynamic had shifted. Silence exposed expectations no one had ever named. But you stayed calm within it, not detached in a cold way, detached in a clear way. You began choosing when to speak, instead of feeling compelled to speak. You responded when it felt aligned, not pressured. You allowed silence to hold what no explanation would improve. That's when something surprising happened. Respect began to replace noise. Conversations became more intentional. The people who valued you adjusted without protest. Those who resisted revealed their dependence on your emotional labor. And you didn't argue with the revelation. You let it be. This was not anger. It was self-trust. Letting silence represent you means accepting that you cannot control how you're perceived and no longer trying to. It means understanding that clarity isn't always verbal, that boundaries do not require speeches, that your internal certainty does not need external validation. You stopped explaining not because you lacked care, but because you cared enough to conserve yourself. There is a subtle power in restraint, not reacting immediately, not correcting every assumption, not stepping into every emotional invitation. Silence became your filter. If someone demanded effort instead of offering respect, the silence remained. If someone pushed for access without consent, the silence held. If a conversation required you to diminish yourself, the silence protected you. You didn't disappear. You became more selective. Selective with your time. Selective with your language. Selective with your presence. And in that selection, your inner state steadied. The constant tension faded. The need to justify eased. You stopped feeling responsible for other people's reactions. You learned this truth slowly. Your calm detachment is not indifference. It is intelligence at work. You are not withdrawing from connection. You are withdrawing from depletion. Letting silence represent you doesn't mean you have nothing to say. It means when you speak, it matters. Your words are no longer used to negotiate your worth. They are used intentionally when clarity adds value, and silence fills the rest. You noticed how much energy this reclaimed. No more rehearsing responses. No more ruminating over conversations. No more trying to anticipate reactions. Space returned to your mind. And in that space, something essential reformed. Self-direction. You began moving differently, not as a response, but by choice. Your decisions felt quieter, but stronger. Your boundaries felt softer, but firmer. Silence ceased being a gap to fill. It became a stable ground to stand on. People responded accordingly. Some leaned closer, more thoughtfully. Some stepped back, unsure how to engage without the cues you used to provide. Some quietly drifted away. You didn't chase. You didn't explain. You let silence do what words never could. It separated genuine connection from dependency. It preserved your energy without conflict. It communicated self-respect in a language that required no translation. And most importantly, it returned something to you that constant explanation had taken away: authority over your own presence. Letting silence represent you is not about being untouchable. It's about being unburdened. You are no longer carrying the emotional weight of every interaction, no longer assuming responsibility for comfort that isn't yours to provide. You remain open but not available by default, present but not porous, engaged but not obligated. Silence allows that balance. It doesn't harden you, it steadies you. And when you do speak now, the words come from certainty, not defense, not fear, not habit. This is what detachment without anger looks like: calm clarity, selective presence, and the quiet confidence of someone who knows when enough has already been said. Your silence is not empty, it is intentional, and it speaks for you with precision that explanation never could. There was a time when you moved through the world with your guard always up, not because you were aggressive, but because you were prepared. Prepared to explain yourself, prepared to justify your choices, prepared to soften reactions before they came, prepared to defend intentions that were never harmful. Defense became second nature, so subtle that you didn't even recognize how tired it made you. You learned to anticipate criticism before it arrived, to brace yourself in conversations, to clarify before anyone asked, to reassure before anyone doubted, and slowly, unknowingly, you carried tension everywhere you went. Standing without defense is what happens when that tension finally releases. It doesn't happen because the world becomes safer. It happens because you become steadier. You stop confusing awareness with vigilance. You stop mistaking readiness for strength. And one day, almost imperceptibly, you realize something has shifted. You are no longer preparing for confrontation that hasn't happened. You begin entering spaces without rehearsing your responses. You listen without planning rebuttals. You speak without checking whether your words will be approved. You remain present without shrinking or posturing. This is not passivity, it is composure. Standing without defense means trusting yourself enough to let situations reveal themselves without interference. You no longer feel compelled to control perception. You no longer rush to correct narratives. You no longer adjust your tone to preempt discomfort, because you understand now, defensiveness does not protect truth. It distorts it. When you stopped defending yourself, you discovered an unexpected relief. Your shoulders softened, your breath deepened, your reactions slowed. Conversations stopped feeling like battlegrounds and started feeling like exchanges, or ended when they no longer needed to continue. You learned that not every misunderstanding needs resolution. Not every opinion requires response. Not every judgment deserves engagement. Some things lose power when left untouched. This is where quiet authority lives. Authority that does not announce itself. Authority that does not convince. Authority that does not insist. It simply is. People notice it not because you demand recognition, but because there is no longer tension in your presence. You're not braced. You're not guarded. You're grounded. Standing without defense doesn't mean you stopped caring. It means you stopped compensating. You no longer over-explain your boundaries. You no longer soften your certainty. You no longer react to provocation with urgency. You let people have their reactions without absorbing them. And that creates space. Space where you can be exactly as you are without adjustment. Space where your self-respect does not need to be performed. Space where your decisions are not negotiations. This is emotional release, not explosive, but profound. The release of needing to be understood by everyone. The release of managing impressions. The release of performing clarity for comfort. You realize how much energy defense required, how much attention it consumed, how quietly it shaped your behavior. Without it, you feel lighter, more direct, more honest in your stillness. You don't resist disagreement. You don't chase agreement. You let conversations meet you where you stand or not at all. Standing without defense means allowing silence after you speak. It means not rushing to soften statements. It means trusting your intention enough to let it stand alone. At first, this unsettles others. Some are used to your reassurance. Some are accustomed to emotional accessibility. Some expect you to bend, but you don't harden in response. You don't explain yourself back into old roles. You remain calm, steady, unmoved. Because defense was never your strength, presence was, and now your presence is unburdened. You are not withholding. You are not distant. You are clear, clear enough to let people show you who they are, clear enough to step back without guilt. Clear enough to remain open without absorbing what isn't yours. This clarity is quiet but unmistakable. It changes how you walk into rooms, how you hold eye contact, how you pause before speaking. There is no rush anymore. And in that unhurried space, you feel something settle inside you. Self-respect that doesn't need reinforcement. You don't defend your boundaries. You live inside them. You don't justify your decisions. You stand by them. You don't argue your worth. You move from it. This is quiet authority, not because you've gained control over others, but because you've released the need to defend yourself to them. And that is where emotional release truly completes itself. Not in confrontation, not in closure, not in validation, but in this moment of standing without armor, without explanation, without resistance, just steadiness. You understand now that defensiveness was never protection. It was habit, and once the habit dissolves, what remains is you, clear, grounded, and unmistakably self-directed. You don't need to be louder. You don't need to be sharper. You don't need to be tougher. You simply stand where you are, and that is enough.